I'm in the business of wanting to resurrect that triumphant beast in you.
Welcome to The Boundless Body, the podcast with a somatic doctor interviewing innovative thinkers about their perspectives relating to the arts and sciences of therapy. Discover The Boundless Body.
Back to the mystery.
Okay, today we are blessed with the presence of Dr. Greg Madison. Welcome to The Boundless Body, Dr. Greg.
Thank you, Brian. Very happy to be here.
Yeah. So as usual, I'm just going to read out your bio as an introduction. And here we go. Dr. Greg Madison is an existential psychologist, an associate fellow of the British Psychological Society, focusing-oriented psychotherapist, and coordinator for the International Focusing Institute of New York. For some years, Greg has avoided exclusive affiliation with any institution and instead enjoys creative collaborations as an independent lecturer, contributing to various academic, community, and professional trainings internationally. He's written and co-edited books and articles on existential migration. Hope we can talk about that one. Focusing-oriented psychotherapy, existential therapy, and contemporary topics related to psychology and society. He is the founder of the London Focusing Institute, a team of teachers and students of focusing working according to democratic principles. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's talk about focusing. How'd you get interested in the work of Eugene Gendlin?
Yeah. It really was by accident. When I started my undergraduate degree in psychology, I was fortunate to have a professor who knew Gendlin and was in contact with him about dreams, because Gendlin was writing his book on dreams, Let Your Body Interpret Your Dreams. And this professor was a dream researcher, so they were collaborating. He told me about focusing. He tried to get me to focus, and I shied away from that invitation a number of times. I'm not exactly sure why. I think it sounded a little too intimate to me. But I eventually got the book, read it, taught myself, began to practice it, and also used it 3 different times in qualitative research. So my very first introduction to focusing was partly personal and partly as an academic research method.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So on the Boundless Body, we often talk about this phenomenon of the initiatory illness, which many of us psychologists have that journey. And I'm kind of assuming, and maybe I shouldn't assume, but many of us go through this journey. I mean, I think you kind of hinted at it with this, this kind of vulnerability or this kind of fear of intimacy. Can you speak to that? Did you have any experiences that could align with that concept?
Well, let me tell you a very different answer to your initial question.
Okay.
I mean, there's many stories we can tell about everything in life. And another way of telling this story is that as I grew up, I had a strong sense inside of myself of what was right for me. I had a very strong feeling kind of light in me that could direct me in particular ways, and I listened to it. I valued it, but no one else in my life seemed to. Everyone else was telling me what was right and what was wrong, what I should do, how I should be, how I should look. So when I came across Gendlin's writing, it was the very first time I came across a figure of authority, some distinguished professional and a psychologist and philosopher who actually said that this feeling life inside you is worth paying attention to. In fact, it can guide your life. So for me, the reason that I read the book and kept reading it, and it has become a part of my life rather than just another half-read book on my shelf, is because it gave me permission to pay attention to something that I already knew in some way. And that's really why focusing became a part of my life.
The Boundless Body podcast is brought to you by BiTap, the creators of a powerful bilateral stimulation tool for nervous system regulation. I use this tapping technology clinically because it's a wonderful, gentle, pulsatile, tactile stimulation that helps the brain to regulate experience. And what I mean by regulate experience is not just managing the bad stuff, but amplifying the good stuff. So these tappers aren't just used clinically, they're used in many different settings, including with frontline workers, people that have test anxiety, kids and parents, teachers and school counselors, people in addiction recovery, restless sleepers, and people that are struggling with pain management and medical issues. So the benefits are vast. You can go to the BiTap website to get your tappers to help with your nervous system, and you can enter the Brian10 code to get your discount. I hope you enjoy the show. Beautiful. Thank you for that. I think the writing is on the wall with that, what you just said about this phrase that I read out in your bio, which I really like, that you've avoided exclusive affiliation with any institution, which I can really vibe with, because, like so many institutions and kind of platforms for healing have these terminologies and jargon systems and stuff like that end up being this weird kind of hierarchy.
Yeah.
And there's really this sense of a person's unique and individual way of feeling, sensing, and expressing. It isn't adequately nurtured.
Absolutely. I agree with everything you said and the way you said it. The only thing that I would add is just the word oppressive. I find those structures, they're so rigid. They don't live. They don't easily evolve and change with the people that inhabit them. Instead, they become oppressive to whoever happens to work there. And the institute itself becomes the master rather than the servant. And I find it really difficult to collude with that.
Yeah, before we clicked record, both of us were kind of laughing about my early experiences with nonviolent communication out here in California. And I remember thinking to myself when somebody was running the terminologies and technologies of it, gosh, this stuff is really violent.
Yeah. I think maybe it's almost anything that becomes sort of set in technical language so that some people know the language and some people don't. Then it means that some people can do something to another group of people that don't even know they're having something done to them. And just that kind of set body of knowledge or technique or practices that then become imposed upon self and other. That I think is really problematic. We have to have a way of being able to talk back to those kinds of structures so that they change, as you said, to take account of us.
Have you ever heard this term virtue signaling?
Yes.
It's a good one, huh?
Yeah, it is.
How do you think that fits into what we've just been talking about?
That's a very big question.
What a great laugh you have, Greg. Like it's a very hearty, it's for real. It's embodied, I have the goosebump response in my legs because it's integrated, it feels very good.
Well, I'm thinking immediately of all the things I could say and shouldn't say. That makes me like the humor of that. I don't know what to say in response to that, except there is something slightly puritanical and something slightly oppressive that has evolved under the guise of something very caring and progressive. And that's what I find, that there's a real pinch there. It's difficult to challenge something that's pretending to be for the good. And yet you can sense in the way that something is being enacted that there's something about it that isn't quite good.
Sensitively articulated. I really appreciate that. Democratically articulated. Well done. I think this phenomenon is kind of all over the place, but the somatics community has a unique way of doing it, and I'm presuming that the focusing community isn't completely immune to this stuff, because oppression is it's like the water that we're swimming in. And in this existential search for meaning, I think this is where it connects with existential philosophy, that there's this existential drive to doing meaningful things that it can distort reality.
Yeah.
And then people grab a hold of terminologies and technologies and so on that, are kind of like almost, they become like a new holy grail or something like that. And then oppression can happen without a person meaning to do it.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely.
In fact, the paradox is that, they can be fighting oppression, while meanwhile doing some of this stuff that's been talked about for, 150 years, identification with the aggressor.
Mm-hmm. That's, I think you're actually pointing out, I don't know what to call it, but the nuance that is very difficult to challenge, because usually I think the intention is to correct something or to address an injustice. There's something positive, I think, generally in these moves. But if the move requires shaming or belittling someone else, then you know that there's something wrong in the way it's being enacted. If someone has to feel critical about themselves in response to someone trying to make the world a better place, something isn't quite working there.
Am I correct in saying you have a passion for existential philosophy?
No.
Okay.
I make a distinction there. I have a passion for existential psychotherapy or for existential phenomenological psychotherapy. My issue with it is exactly what you've just been describing, is that existential philosophy can be turned into a doctrine. It can become a kind of a theory that you apply to working with another person. And that's not what existential philosophy is meant to be. Existential philosophy, from my perspective, is just an accumulation of insights from trying to work phenomenologically, where you try to work in the most open way possible. You try to set aside your own prejudices, biases, so-called knowledge, your expectations, and you try to be as open to what is as you possibly can be. Existential philosophy, as much as anything else, can get in the way of that. And in that case, I'm not for that kind of philosophy. I'm for the kind of philosophy that comes directly from experience and then is open to constantly being corrected.
Yeah. And I would imagine this necessitates an encounter with the dark side.
Yes. Well, maybe it raises the question of, is there such a thing as a dark side? But certainly it necessitates an encounter with all of existence, including aspects of existence that we wish were different than they are.
So you do some tinkering around with democracy and, like how focusing might be applied at the large system scale, that we're orbiting at a wide orbit. I think we've started from a zoomed out perspective and we'll orient to zooming in into like what focusing is and how can it be applied clinically and so on. But like on the large system scale, certainly there's shadow stuff, there's dark stuff happening, there's splitting, there's binaries, there's a lack of bridging. How do you apply the focusing philosophy and this phenomenological orientation to this bigger picture stuff?
I think that's a very good question. I don't think it's been done. And I think there's a lot of space for someone to develop that. I want to answer your question from the other way around. And then I'll see if I can offer anything in response to what you're actually asking. So I want to answer a different question first. And that is, what can the focusing practice show us about democracy? And for me, I take that, first of all, I'm beginning to believe it has to happen with the individual first. That if the individual can have a democratic attitude towards themselves, and this maybe answers some of the things you've already been pointing to, that would mean being able to experience yourself as a community of parts, as different aspects, as different impulses, whatever you want to call that a human being is not some kind of integrated whole self, not some kind of glorious oneness, but instead is a community of sort of parts that arise and fall and come up in response to what's happening. And if you have that kind of inclusive attitude towards yourself, where you can welcome and accept every aspect of who you are, then I think you begin to approach other people in a very different way. And you also begin to realize that some of your opinions are so closely held and so aggressively expressed because inside of you, there may be a part of you that doesn't agree. And it comes out that forcefully in order to try to silence the part of you that's going, well, but if you have a democratic kind of attitude towards yourself, not a kind of majority rule democracy, but a kind of a consensus democracy where every single aspect of yourself, no matter how quiet and shy and half developed and fragmented and wounded it is, every aspect of yourself gets an equal hearing. If you start with that attitude towards your own experiencing of life, it's much easier to have that attitude towards someone else. And you will realize there will be aspects of you, not all of you, but aspects of you that can agree with some aspects of what other people are saying.
Very nice. I'm reminded of James Hillman's phrase, a self or an individual as a unity is a delusion of the monotheistic mind.
Yeah.
I think he just nails it there. And then the other phrase that comes to mind is the Dr. Brian phrase, life will eventually make hypocrites of us. So I'm thinking about my own inner politician. Politicians are like famous for, hypocrisy. And I'm thinking of my own inner politician who was like, this pure yogi for a while, who used to judge on people with SUVs and cell phones. And I remember like 5 years later or whatever, having both an SUV and a cell phone. And I remember like scratching my head going, oh yeah, there's me making a hypocrite of myself again, just growing up, just.
Well, there's always, that the self as a multiplicity, I think, is experientially what we find. And we get very confused if we try to make ourselves into one consistent being with one voice. It's easier, I think, to admit that we are contradictory and that we're fragmented and that we are unfinished. That's one of the things that Gene Gendlin says. A human being is unfinished. We seem to want to have some kind of a set identity, like this thing, do you know yourself? Well, how can you know a self that is still forming? A human being is always still forming, always still becoming something, always still in a process of elaboration. And that process isn't sort of one track. There's all sorts of ways that a person elaborates themselves in every moment. And if we can be open to that and welcome everything that's there, it's a little bit easier to say, well, a part of me feels X, and I'm noticing a part of me feels Y, and I'm trying to be open to both.
I see how you're making this connection with a kind of inner democracy. Like, okay, what does this part have to say? How's it going?
Yeah.
And what do you think are the benefits and limitations of models like IFS, where you kind of have a naming structure for various parts that are kind of posited to cut across systems?
My concern with that, not knowing the model well, but any model like that names something, my concern is just that it makes it seem as though a human being is a bunch of set content. An inner critic, an inner father, an inner saboteur, an inner, whatever. And I don't think that's true. I think a person, and this again is the influence of focusing and Gendlin, that a human being is process. And it's much more, rather than these little people inside of us that are always the same, and we can actually call them by a name because they will always manifest in a particular way or have a particular attitude. I think it is much more like the way a wave arises on the sea. A wave arises, and you can point to that wave as though, it has some kind of existence of its own, but it temporarily arises, and then it goes back to the sea that it arose from, and it's never separate from that. So if you work with a so-called part, it's not surprising that working on one part of yourself can affect many different parts of you, because you're not actually working with one separate part. You're working with one part of your process.
Well, since you've named process and the process orientation of Gendlin, can you just kind of unpack Gendlin's map? I'm aware that the beginning is often this clearing of the space.
Yeah.
That's like process number one in the big process is let's clear a space.
Yeah. I can say a bit about Gendlin and about focusing, how it sort of first came. I should first say that years later, Gendlin regretted that he described focusing in these kind of 6 steps, because a lot of people thought, oh, focusing is a 6-step process. He meant that the steps were a way of pointing you towards something that is who you are. It's something about what a human being is, and a human being can find because it's there. Once you've found it, you can forget about his steps and the other steps. But his steps were, first of all, clearing a space, getting a little bit of space so you could actually come into your body. Because that takes time. For most of us, we go through life sort of from the neck up. And to actually, first of all, say, ask yourself, what's in between me and being fully present or feeling okay? You will notice that there's a number of different things on your mind. You can acknowledge each one and then imagine kind of setting it outside of yourself, so you're not carrying it on the inside. And that, if you follow that process without getting involved or trying to fix anything, just acknowledging what's there and setting it outside, often you can get some sense of space inside of your body. In that space, then you can go more deeply into yourself and either ask, so how am I right now? And you're engaged with your bodily being rather than just what you think about yourself. Or you can ask yourself, that issue that's been on my mind, can I just get a body sense of that, what Gendlin called a felt sense, and sort of stay with it and let it unfold in my body? The process involves really coming into contact with what is concretely and palpably present for you, giving it some space so it can form into what Gendlin called a felt sense. It can come initially as a sensation or an emotion, But if you give it a little bit more space, often it becomes what Gentleman called a felt sense. He used that term very specifically. I know it's been used a lot by many other people, but what he meant was this more holistic sense. It's like a body aura of something that you're living through. And from that point of view, it has all of this information in it. If you just stay with that feeling in the body, quite spontaneously, you start getting a sense of how you would describe it. Describe it, not explain it. Like what words or images sort of really fit the way it feels. And as you follow that very phenomenological descriptive process, you get usually little insights into what it's really about for you. And it can be quite different than what you thought it was about. And you know that you're understanding it if you can feel the kind of the body shifts. You feel the body kind of, letting go. There's a deep breath. There's a feeling of release. And you know that, okay, something about that is right. You know you're on the right track in some way. That's the focusing process. You're following the way that the body is holding something, and you're allowing it to have its own, as Gentleman would say, carrying forward, or its own body process. That given the right kind of environment, the right kind of accepting attitude, the body knows how to change itself. It doesn't have to be told how to do that. That process actually happens quite naturally. That's focusing.
One of the terms that I really love coming from Gendlin is the term the handle.
Yeah.
I think it's very, very clinically useful. I use it all the time.
Okay.
Can you describe the handle, like what it is? And I mean, in a way, you've already set us up for it. That's why I'm saying it.
Yeah.
What is a handle?
The handle is, it's not used maybe as much in focusing anymore, but it still is a very useful term. It points to the way that a word or a phrase or an image or a gesture, something can come from the feeling as a way of kind of holding on to the whole feeling in the body. And then you can work with the handle. If, for example, you're dealing with an issue at work, and the feeling you get in your body, you're grappling for the right word, and you say, it's like I'm pissed off, and you think, well, it's not quite pissed off. It's more like I'm annoyed. It's not quite annoyed. It's more like, it's like I've lost my enthusiasm. You'll get a bit of a breath if that's a closer handle. And then you can use that handle, I've lost my enthusiasm, and go back and forth between the situation and the feeling. It's so, what is it exactly that's happening at work that brings this, I've lost my enthusiasm? And that the handle, the way Gentleman was using it, is like a handle on a suitcase. It's just using that little phrase brings the whole feeling with it.
And with handles, in my understanding of them and my use of them clinically, there can often be this image component, this sensory component, as if that, that briefcase or, whatever it is that we're holding carries with it all sorts of somatic information, somatic imagery, for example, people just throw around sometimes really powerful phrases like, it's almost like I have a rock in my belly.
Yeah.
Like, almost like a rock in your belly. There's a lot of information encoded in that little phrase there.
Yeah. And if somebody says something like that, then you're really on to something you can work with. In a focusing way, the first thing you would say, maybe, depending on the client and your relationship with them, one of the first things you might say is, well, where do you feel that? And if they say, well, it's right down in the bottom, then you could say, would it be okay just to bring your attention right down there? That's different than being in the head looking down. It's like, can you actually be down there with it? Not in it, but with it, almost like you're keeping it company down there. And if the person can do that, then you can resonate the handle to see if it still fits. because even bringing that kind of attitude to a body's feeling can already change it. You can say, so does it still feel like a rock in your belly? And you're inviting the person to check their own term with the feeling itself. And often they already start to refine it. And it's that process of kind of refining the symbolization that actually moves the body towards, you could say, more life, more freedom, and insight.
So mental imagery is part of the process?
Not if it's just mental imagery.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If it's imagery that resonates with the body.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then the process is always kind of from the image or from the word or phrase back to the body, back to the symbolizing, back to the body. It's always back to the body. And that's one of the things that we often don't do. I mean, even if you start with the body, like a rock in the belly, you could ask a person to start telling you about that. And they might start telling you all sorts of things, but never go back to the body.
Mm-hmm.
In focusing, we're always basically wanting to say, does your body agree with that? The way you're telling the story, the words you're using, is the body still on board with all of that? So it's always checking back with the body every step.
Uh-huh. What does all this have to do with emotion?
Well, first of all, I would say in psychology, we come up with all of these distinctions. Do these distinctions actually exist? If you have a rock in the belly, what is that? Is it a
disgust affect?
Is it affect? Is it emotion? Is it sensation? Is it meaning? Is it physiological? Is it psychological? Is it spiritual? It's like the body sense comes before those distinctions are made.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you have a clearly defined emotion that's different than a felt sense, Gendon would say a clearly defined emotion has a kind of a cultural story to it. It's like in this culture, if someone hits me in the face, I feel offended, annoyed, I hit back or something. That's like a cultural story, and it's felt as a narrowing down in the body. You're narrowed down into anger or fear or something. You can feel it's a constriction in your being. A felt sense is much more of an expansive feeling. The coming of a felt sense already feels better. So if you feel really angry, you can ask someone, can we give that some space? You kind of feel around that.
Oh, wow.
Exactly. You feel around the anger. Often the word anger doesn't fit at all. It's like it's more, and it's more like confidence. It could be anything else, but if you allow it to expand into a felt sense, then you have a lot more information to work with, and it's easier to have the feeling. It's more vague. It's more like an aura almost, rather than a siphoning down into something.
Yeah, here we encounter again the problematic element of naming systems.
Yeah.
Because I like to say when I'm teaching neuroscience students, like, hey, like most scientists agree that we have basic primordial affects that come in with the motherboard, but nobody can agree on what they are.
Yes, exactly.
Golly. Yeah. Well, and then there's this term or this phrase that's thrown around a fair bit called, if you can name it, you can tame it. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I mean, in some ways it sounds like a decent idea because it indicates control. But then the other side of it is that, oh, hang on, you're taming it. Like,
Yeah.
what are we trying to put the organism on a leash or something like that? Or it's not an image of expansiveness.
Yeah. In focusing, the it you're trying to tame We would want some space for that, the anger, the fear, the whatever it is. And we would also want some space for the part of you that's trying to tame it, the part of you that thinks control is so important. Can we be with both of those without taking sides? That's almost like the inner democracy. We don't want to take sides. We want to allow both of these aspects of you to begin to tell their story.
I love this orientation to expansiveness because there's so many models and naming systems that just have a general sense of squeezing and squinting. And I'd just like to add another ing word that comes from Genlin that I think is really important called joining. Okay, so I heard this story and I've been using it as an example of what I call radical joining. And the story goes that Genlin, working in some institution, encountered some person that was smearing poop on the wall. You familiar with this narrative where Genlin essentially just got out his rubber gloves and just started joining the patient in, sort of the smearing process and kind of like, okay, well, what are we up to today? Like what are the symbols that we're drawing now on the walls? And I use that as a kind of radical example of how different and powerful and expansive the capacity to join can be. I mean, that is just so powerful. And I don't even know if it's right. I don't even know if it happened. I just remember reading it somewhere.
I've never read that story, but there are some other stories when he was working in a psychiatric hospital. So maybe it does come from there, but his intention would be to join that in the person that is engaged in that behavior. It's like something is trying to happen there and he would welcome that, but he would also welcome the person that's experiencing it.
Mm-hmm.
He would want to welcome all of that. And if you ever see him working, if you watch videos of him working, you can see how sensitively he kind of almost draws out the acceptance of what's happening in the person more than the person does. And that often brings something for the person he's working with, is to have that, not only an acceptance for what's there, but an acceptance for what's trying to be there. Like he talks a lot about what's implied, that the body's process is always implying something, and he's wanting to welcome the implied.
So an existential understanding of focusing. What is the meaning of that phrase?
Yeah, good question. Came up with that phrase. I can tell you from two sides. As an existential psychologist, existentialists can become quite conceptual and philosophical. And adding the body or the experiencing process to existentialism brings something else. It brings what I would consider more of a phenomenological process. So I think existentialism needs something like focusing. On the focusing side, I would say, and this could be just the kind of person that I am, I would say focusing needs something like existentialism to keep it open to everything in life, including, and I think maybe this is what you're referring to, the dark side. Not just the dark side of people's personalities, but the dark side of existence itself. That there are aspects of being a human being that are difficult. And we need companies with in order to bear some aspects of what it's like to be a human. The focusing world, I think, intends to be open to all of that, but can get a little one-sided in the direction of what's life enhancing, what's beautiful, what's wonderful, what feels really good about focusing, how focusing can transform people in dramatically positive ways. All of that is true. But I also want to hold out the fact that our bodies also know that they're dying, and that life, the story of life, always ends too soon in a way. We're always kind of mid-sentence somehow. We're never complete. And that's also a part of being a person. And can we also be open to that, to reality and our inability to accept it?
Yeah. When I'm working with couples, I often have to educate and just say, hey, listen, there's this compulsion towards achieving a resolution. Can we just make space for it?
Yeah.
Can we just make space for that?
Yeah. Wonderful.
And you nailed it in the statement about, well, kind of like mid-sentence. There can be that sense at the end of a session or in a relationship that life is incomplete. And there's this urgency, I think, to achieve a resolution, to arrive. I call it arrivalism.
Yeah.
Arrivalism. It's just so rampant.
Yeah.
We'll arrive at a resolution. Well,
Yeah.
I think we need to make space for that. There's a layer of things that is just going to just keep on unfolding and unfolding and unfolding. And we need to develop a tolerance for the irresolvable tensions in life, the irresolvable tensions between parts.
Exactly. And in that example of the couple that you're talking about, hypothetically, I could imagine there's a part that wants to arrive to resolve, but there could also be a part that would rather win than resolve. But there should be a part, within
For
each
sure.
person. If you can admit that, then there's so much, just acknowledging what's there gives so much more space. And if you can say it's a part of me, it's much easier for your partner to hear it. It's like, it's okay. I can accept there's a part of you that wants to win. I know what that's like. I've got a part like that too. But it's different than if they say, I want to win. Then you're in a fight with the whole person.
Yeah, I think there can be this sense that folks are fighting against the fighter within.
Yeah.
David Schnark has this wonderful book called Passionate Marriage. And in that book, he just has, I think it's a timeless classic. He's got a chapter in the book called Normal Marital Sadism. And what's so awesome about that is it's like, hey, listen, folks, you got a sadist. Why are you fighting it? Why are you trying to pose innocence? Why are you trying to compulsively snatch on to innocence as a kind of, blank check for doing whatever you want to do to be right?
Yeah. And I feel like this circles back a little bit to your question about virtue signaling. If we can admit that there's a part of us that loves to see the other person squirm, if we can admit that, then suddenly there's a little bit of space, maybe even a sense of humor about it. Maybe the other person also breaks out laughing because they immediately recognize that kind of a part.
Mm-hmm.
But as long as it's underground and acted out, then it doesn't get welcomed.
So Gendlin's philosophical backdrop, what were some of the figures contributing to that backdrop? Did he write about this existentialist element, the kind of darker side, or who is he informed by, and what was the kind of zoomed out element of his philosophy?
His philosophy, I would say, because it's kind of the channel that I'm in, I would say that his philosophy is within the existential phenomenological tradition.
Mm-hmm.
He would agree with that, but he would maybe also say it's within the American pragmatist tradition, which I don't know very well. Certainly within the tradition of Dilthey and people like that wanted to evolve human science rather than a natural science, and the importance of understanding rather than just explaining. In terms of the darker side, he and I had an ongoing discussion/argument about that. And I wrote about it in a chapter for a book on existential therapy. The chapter is called Exhilarating Pessimism. And that was my term for what I wanted to stand up for. And what he wanted to stand up for was what he called not pink optimism. So a kind of optimism that wasn't all flowery and beautiful and wonderful, but still had this kind of optimism to it. And we spent hours trying to figure out if we were actually talking about the same thing and just using different terms.
I think
He didn't like the term pessimism. And there is a philosophical tradition of pessimism, which I find valuable. Yeah, and I don't know if he would have.
Well, it sounds a bit like Nietzsche.
Nietzsche is sometimes put in that school. Schopenhauer is sometimes put in that school. Was a very famous Norwegian philosopher, Petter Wessel Sapfa, who was one of the main proponents of it. And Herman Tennyson, another Norwegian Canadian philosopher, was in that. And Sapfa wrote a book called On the Tragic, which I don't think is still being translated into English. And it is an existential tradition, but one that is relentless. I don't know really what to say about it. It kind of relentless in that some existentialism ends up trying to find, like maybe Yalom does this a bit, trying to find an off-ramp into something tolerable and positive. These guys didn't do that. They spoke about human beings as accidentally over-endowed with the ability to have insight into human existence. And that insight means potentially that humans should question why we should procreate. All sorts of things that are really relentlessly trying to look as clearly as possible at what human existence is and whether it should continue is one of their questions.
Well, you mentioned becoming. You mentioned the term becoming.
Yeah.
And although he's not put in the umbrella of existentialism, my great philosophical love is Gilles Deleuze, who, celebrated Nietzsche in Nietzsche's kind of unique way of kind of making a space for the creative act of poo-pooing, the creative act of saying no, the creative act of negation, the creative act of negation. You didn't say effervescent pessimism, but that's how I'm thinking about it. Effervescent pessimism. Like, where was the term that you said from that chapter?
I said exhilarating, but effervescent is nice. Yeah.
They're both E words. They're both kind of in a similar felt sense domain. I think this notion of, who are these authors that you mentioned, or this one in particular that's Norwegian?
Zapfa. Zapffe. Zapfa. Yeah. I should say that Sapfa and Tennyson and Arnnes and all these other people that hung out together were incredibly alive. Many of them were hikers and mountain climbers and risk takers and very disruptive and sort of unconventional, but absolutely full of life. They were not depressed. They were not like, oh my God, this is horrible. None of them lived like that. They all were really, really alive. And that's what I would say about the word, as I'm using it, pessimism, is really just an acceptance, or maybe acceptance is the wrong, not accept in that you're glad, but accept in that, can I see this? Can I bear seeing this? And for me, the felt impact of that is actually exhilarating. It feels very alive. It feels very expansive. It feels like I'm not over here trying to live while over here I'm trying not to see something. It's like really embracing not only my existence, but existence itself. And that existence somehow lives through me, and sort of allowing that and witnessing it. And for me, it feels very alive, much more alive than an emphasis on positivity, which for me is a kind of giving up. It's like I have to accentuate the positivity in everything because I don't trust that life as it actually is good enough.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Existentialism, it's helped me to kind of, as Paul Tillich would say, be in touch with the naked absolute.
Yeah.
To meet existence with a deep vulnerability.
Yes.
I don't carry with me some sort of transcendental thing that's going to get me to touch the ejection seat.
Yeah, exactly.
And I believe Tillich said it really well in that, in touch with the naked absolute, showing up naked. I mean, I'm not going to show up to a psychotherapy session naked, however, just from an existential perspective, just like the big question, death, and, this question of pessimism and negativity, to just, rather than having an idealization about where life should be or where the moment should be, I can make space for, you're fucking annoying me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to squash you,
Mm-hmm.
or I'm bored,
Mm-hmm.
or, I'm distracted, or whatever it is, whatever existence presents to us, Rilke, the great poet Rilke, his hero was this, I believe he was a Swedish author, Swedish or Norwegian. I don't know what's up with these Swedish Norwegian people. It's something about the Aurora Borealis or something.
Long winters.
Yeah, Jacobson was his name, his mentor, Rilke's mentor. And he wrote a book called Niels Lyn. And Niels Lyn was one of Rilke's favorite books. He just loved this book. And in this book is very much an existentialist book. You have these two poets that are lovers and they're married and they write poetry and all this stuff. And at the ending, there's this kind of sublime and terrible and tragic and beautiful ending where the wife who's dying decides to, instead of meet the moment naked with her partner, in terms of not, you know what I mean by naked?
Yeah.
She decided to call in the priest and essentially ask him to leave. And he was just destroyed by this moment, just destroyed, because he wanted to have this vulnerable kind of poetic, not knowing, hey, let's go into this space together. And it's just this glorious moment to get at the nexus of forces that we're talking about here in a poetic kind of narrative way. I think it's just so beautiful.
Yeah. And it sounds very tragic.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. But through the art of the form, the expressive form, the tragedy takes on a different dimension. It becomes a very life-affirming, vulnerability-affirming piece.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, there's something about, well, tragedy can be an art form, and it is an art form.
Yeah.
It can put us in touch with the deep beauty and the rawness of existence.
Absolutely. It can feel so right to be open to that experience.
Greg, I often think grieving is such an important process in healing. Can you speak to that? Like it can be challenging to kind of build a bridge from these big ideas, about tragedy and existentialism and the dark side with just the kind of human everyday, what's happening and what are we feeling and what are we sensing and what's happening in the clinic and so on. I'm bringing forward grief because me personally, I think it has a lot to do with healing, not just on a personal level, but on a social level. And I can say more about that after I send the baton over to you or the talking stick over to you and see what your thoughts are on grief and how it connects with this stuff. But I just wanted to bring in grief as a topic.
The first two things that I would say are contradictory. One is, grieving is fundamental to life, I would say, and on a daily basis. I think we easily ignore it in its more subtle forms, but I think we do experience it constantly, all through the day. The little griefs that we, kind of bear. And then, of course, there's the larger ones that we can't ignore. But the other thing that I would say is, well, what do we mean by grief? What is grief? And that is a question for the body, is to be able to ask into someone that says, I think this is grief, can we be with it? And what is it really? What is this that you're calling grief? And see if they can stay with it until, something that arises that begins to clarify what this experience is and changes it as it's being clarified. But grief, is just a pointer towards something that's more than grief.
Yeah, there was this fulcrum when you were articulating the contradiction where, you kind of opened up the label, opened up the signifier, the kind of smacking a name on it that tends to put things in boxes and then can, prevent us many times, I think, from actually feeling the intensities of whatever this ising inside of us, like what's ising?
Yeah.
What do we mean by it? When you were telling the tale of the everyday grief, these little griefs that I felt it right there in my guts. I felt the kind of ignition process in my lacrimal glands, in my eyes. I felt this kind of moistening, and I could say, oh, well, that's my limbic system. And it probably is, but then we have another label.
Yeah, how the body evokes its meaning. There's all different ways of understanding that, one of which is biology. But it is still a whole body response that is meaningful. If you were to stay with that resonating when I was saying what I was saying, and you could feel the tears just behind your eyes, if you were to stay with that, more would come. And there would be more words and more symbols, none of which would be a conclusion, each of which would just be one step. And it would go on and open up something more and more.
Well, you've worked with activists in the past. And on the show, episode, 6 or something like that, I talked with David Bridell, who's a clown trainer who offers some examples of, like sophisticated clowns bringing playfulness and spontaneity to the activism scene, going to, war-torn countries and stuff like that to kind of offer humor and offer this strange complexity that a clown can do, holding with space this tension between comedy and tragedy, and using this function to support bridge building between binaries. And I often think, wow, what a cool alternative.
Yeah.
What a cool alternative. And then another alternative that I was thinking about is what about if people could just get together and cry?
Mhm.
Like public grieving rituals, that this is like a thing that's done. There's people out there that are doing that, facilitating a space for grieving. But, the cautionary note there is that what's difficult about this stuff is to structure it. But I think these are good directions as a kind of alternative to this aggressive splitting, binarization, this othering stuff that happens where it's just kind of like a horrible tennis match,
Yeah.
between, over a Grand Canyon or something like that. So what do you think about that? What do you think about those alternatives?
I think the idea of public grieving, I haven't heard of that, and that sounds wonderful to me. I've heard of all sorts of things that I think are very creative and innovative, like going for dinner and sitting across from a stranger and being given a menu of questions to ask each other that are quite personal, and you have no idea who this person is. All sorts of ways of trying to invite people into their commonalities somehow. I think that all of that is positive, and I love all of that. Some years ago, I came up with the idea of a map of human experience, and it was the same thing. It was about trying to, like, throughout a city, have different areas in the city that were dedicated to different kinds of human experiences. Like, there could be a part of a park that's all about human grieving and people having the opportunity to tell their stories or to post their stories or to have other people responding to their stories. I love all of that. I think arts and creativity in politics helps
Yeah.
very much.
So Genlin was an advocate for the arts.
Uh, I don't know if he was.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't
Interesting.
know what he would say about that.
Yeah. Well, I find with clients that, not all of them, it depends on what the alliance is like, what the relationship is like. But I think that the arts and artistic expression and finding one's way into expressing these intensities, these that have us, that are inside, that are incubating right now from moment to moment, that the arts are just such a valuable resource that are under tapped, especially at the kind of world scale. And religion ends up sadly being a divisive factor. So someplace in between would be art and creativity.
Yeah, definitely. It makes me think of psychotherapy training. And wouldn't it be nice if there was literature, more impactful fiction that's a part of psychotherapy training? I think if you want to know about the human experience, literature is a better place to go than psychology textbooks.
I like the fantasy genre. I'm going public with it right now. There's a part of me that's embarrassed about that. But I can say just the advocacy part and the researcher in me, just to kind of stand up for that part. Hey, I learned a lot about psychology from a very young age, from things like The Hobbit, and from, this really rich fantasy tradition that has a way of explaining experience, I think, better than freaking Kohut or whatever,
Yeah,
it's
I agree.
it's just so rich.
Yeah, I agree.
We talked about flattening before we clicked record. When you add these logical terminologies, the experience can get flattened.
You can feel the difference even if you're in a conversation with someone and someone starts to name or explain something that you were excited about. You can feel the excitement kind of going,
oh, yeah, exactly. Oh, let's put that in this. Oh, that's
yeah.
Oh, that's that. Oh, that's your social. That's your ventral vagus.
And you can feel the relief of keeping it open. If you can keep things open and not conclude them and name them and explain them, it feels better. It just feels more spacious, and it feels like there's more to come there. I will understand this even more tomorrow because I haven't tied it up with a bow and pinned it on the wall.
I spoke about this phraseology from sociology called the collapse of the sacred canopy. I think it's a very powerful term because in psychotherapy, there can be these terminologies and the evidence-based movement and the kind of obsession around efficiencies and everything like that. And then, but also funneling everything into the interpretive dynamics of the family has a way of just collapsing and flattening the mystery and the beauty and the complexity and the multiplicity of all this, all this being this.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And the fact that you can feel it bodily is very helpful, because as soon as you feel that flattening, you just back up a minute and say, no, that's not right. Obviously it's not right, because if it makes you feel less alive, it's leaving something out.
Yeah. I know exactly what you mean. I'm unpacking a narrative, something I'm really excited about, and then somebody can just smack a label right on it, and it's like almost kind of like a minor shockwave. Talk about little moments of grief.
Yeah.
Just like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Ouch.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Ouch.
Yeah, it's very felt.
Well, I have two more things I'd like to talk with you about.
Okay.
One is the goosebump response, the tingle response. Now, I personally think it's a really important phenomenology.
Okay.
Have you had that experience? Have you, that at key clinical moments and in groups and so on, that you get this tingle response?
Definitely. I'm curious to hear what you make of it.
I found a piece of research that was quite interesting about chimpanzee behavior, and that, chimps have this kind of strange collective activity they engage in when they're faced with a waterfall. And when they're faced with a waterfall, they do these ecstatic pant hoots, like these hoots, they just hoot. In a sort of community gesture that looks like reverence and feels like reverence to the observers. And what they've found is that the chimps, when they're engaged in this behavior, almost always have the involuntary piloerection response, the goosebump response. And so my theory is that there's research that people that are high in openness to experience on the ocean model, the big 5 traits, get the goosebump response more often. So there's literature based behind it, that it's equated with subjective feelings of awe and transcendence, and often, is elicited by environmental epiphanies and music and art and so on. But those are all just signifiers and labels to kind of like try to like name what it is. And to me, it's the felt sense of reverence and gloriousness.
Okay. As you were naming all of those things, I was thinking, I could probably, to some extent at least, take all of those names and think, all of those fit to some extent. Reverence is probably a little bit closer. So I certainly know the experience you're talking about. I could probably remember a time recently when I've had that, and then go into it a little bit more. Through remembering it, the body can recreate it a little bit. Then I actually have the data to sort of begin to explore what is this, and I may come up with the word reverence and think that's what it is. It's a reverence of all that is, or a reverence of my place in the world, or reverence of how the world is living through me, or something. I could come up with a little phrase. But my question is, in that research, and you might not know the answer, but in that research, I'm wondering if the observers of the chimps also had the response.
Well, they don't explicitly mention that in the research article, but I think there would be all sorts of factors having to do in the other literature bases around openness to experience. So people that are high in openness to experience are more likely to have this tingle response. So then we could surmise, or we could posit, that it would depend on that the observer's openness to experience.
Okay.
I think that clocks for me kind of clinically. Like, see, the thing is that, and this leads to the final topic, and it's an interesting link that we have available to us here, because, you kind of gave us a direction of how we might go to use focusing to explore this. So my weird final prompt to you is, how would you work with yourself via the focusing technique to explore what you just described, a recent experience of this thing? Like we're kind of like in this atmosphere. You've called it an aura. We're in this atmosphere of this subjective thing that happens. It's in the research. It happens to people. And you've made some sense of it. You have some sense of a felt sense direction. How would you work with yourself around this?
I want to just say the second thing about the research, and then I'll go to your question. The second thing about the research that I wonder about, and you might know the answer to this, is, does it have to be a group of chimpanzees? Wondering if there's something about the embodied, what sometimes is called like the shared field, or something that assists this reverence. So that's a question.
So that's a yes on that. That's what they say. It pretty much always happens in a group, but then they extend that discussion is extended into things like environmental epiphany, where human individuals, without being in a group or just with music, we could make a case that music is, kind of community based, right? But anyways, there's definitely instances where humans can experience it alone, but the authors argue, who mobilized this research about the chimps, they argue that it's the kind of instinctual foundation of the religious instinct, the kind of group field of worship and praise.
Okay.
That's what they argue anyway.
That's interesting to me. In my experience, it happens in groups and it happens alone, as you're saying.
Yeah.
So how would I work with it? The first thing I want to say, as I was listening to you, is it's an interpretation. It's not a description, and it's not coming from my felt sense. It's coming from a memory, which is totally different. And that interpretation is that there is something exhilarating about finding ourselves in a world where we don't belong. And that there's some sense of, we're not at home here. And that's very exciting. And exhilarating.
I just got the tingle response, Greg.
So good. So what gave you that response right now?
It's something about, Deleuze throws down this distinction between content and expression. It's not so much, and it's how you brought the content. It's how it's what you said, insofar as like, when we find ourselves not home, what did you say? A place that's not familiar?
That isn't our home.
That isn't our home. So there's the content of it, but there's something about the way that you expressed it, the expressive dimension that came right into my eardrums, and my whole system is now still vibrating by just the way that you expressed it. And that stuff is qualitative. It's like, I can't just say, oh, well, okay, how you expressed it is this, because then I'm bringing content back onto expression.
Yes. Yeah. I would wonder if it's something about where I am in myself as I say it.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
But let me get to your question. How would I work with it? I can say more generally how I would work with anything like that is clients often come with general stories. It always happens. This always happens to me. It's like, I never get what I want. It's just been, it's like, this is my pattern, blah, blah, blah. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like they've already conceptualized it and come with a whole sort of general way of saying it. I would always say, and I don't think this is so unique to me, but I would always say, can you give me an instance of that?
Mhm.
Because if you have one moment where it actually happened, you
Mhm.
already have something that is 1,000 times richer than any pattern or any generalization.
Mhm.
And you will immediately find, usually, the words, the description, the interpretation, the conclusion they had no longer fits, if they can actually remember an instance. So if they can remember an instance, well, tell me about when that happened, which a lot of people would say. If in the telling of it, I start to feel in myself a feeling, I can feel my body beginning to form a felt sense of the whole situation. That would be a clue to me that that may also be happening in them. And I would ask them, I'm wondering what you feel as you tell me this. Can you feel it a little bit now what that whole thing is like? Almost always they say yes, or they might say, yeah, a little bit. I said, that's all we need. We just need a little bit of it. If they have a little bit of the bodily sense of that whole situation, you can begin to work with it in a focusing way. You can't work with generalities.
Yeah.
You can't work just with story, but sometimes in the telling of a specific story, the body recreates the whole situation much more than just the story. Then you can work with it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like you need the GPS coordinates, as it were.
Yeah.
Like generalization, you're right, big time, is a primary way of distancing,
Yeah.
keeping those experiences distant.
Yeah.
You've given us a trail of breadcrumbs already. If I were doing the focusing with you, I'd be like, well, okay, you already mentioned it. You gave me a handle that it's about a week ago.
Mhm.
We're orienting to this space, and okay, what happened about a week ago? And I'd have you close your eyes more than likely so that you can focus, and boom, we got some GPS coordinates there. It's in about a week ago. And let's see if we can find a specific moment and then map the felt sense. But then often with people, and you wouldn't be doing this because you have so much experience, I doubt you would. Often people will go back into generalization,
Yes.
back into using, like distancing strategies and saying, oh, well, yeah, I mean, I feel compassion. Let's say compassion, like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Like, what are we talking about here? What's the felt sense?
If you notice as someone goes back into generalizations, you might say to the person, reflect back what they just said to keep it alive, and then say, and maybe there's a part of you that's not sure about getting too close to this,
Mm-hmm.
and see what they say about that. The other thing that I would say, if you want to work in this way, being guided by the body is, and this does require, with most people, not all people, it requires some perseverance, is to really teach the client to correct you, to really teach them that you're not invested in being right. You're invested in keeping on track. And so you always want them to correct you. And if they're swallowing too much of what you say, then you have to start saying things like, I'm hardly ever right. You say it.
Literally. Well, I mean, I live in Silicon Valley, though, Greg. I mean, I wouldn't want to say that too quickly.
Well, if you could then maybe say, I'm hardly ever right, but something in you is right. We get it from that.
Yeah. Well, that's expansive right there, like I love this orientation to just an expansive space. Okay. This is an inclusive space. There's not a part within you that isn't welcome.
Yeah.
We're going to call the parts back home. We're going to be in communication with them.
Yes.
You know yourself better than me. And hey, let's explore. This is an adventure. That brings it back into this kind of effervescent space of, negative parts, but there's energy there. There's vitality. There's something that's trying to negate something is actually trying to affirm something else.
Exactly. It's saying no to something because it has a sense of what would be right.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you could leave our listeners with in terms of kind of like a focusing thing that they could do on their own that could be resourcing for them?
Good question. I want to say one more thing that occurs to me about the clinical example, which is implied by what you said. You summed it up really well, is just that in this way of working, there's no such thing as resistance. Because if you call something resistance, you've already taken sides. And that's not phenomenological. You're wanting to welcome everything to be there from its own point of view, in a way, not from your point of view. What could people do that would be the beginning of finding this? I want to say focusing is a totally natural process. It's not actually a technique. It's a way of being, a way of relating to oneself. The most important thing is to bring, and this isn't unique to focusing, but the most important thing is to bring to yourself this kind of openness, this kind of radical acceptance of whatever is there, and to trust. And this takes some practice to find out if it's empirically true for you, but I would say it is, but you don't want to believe me. You'd have to see if it's true. To trust that everything in your experience is there trying to help. Everything in there is a part of you on your side in a way, even if it seems to be very negative or sabotaging or critical or against you. Its intention is not to harm or to hurt you. Its intention is to somehow right something or be protective or something like that. So if you can approach yourself with that kind of a trusting attitude, can I just be with what is? Or as Heidegger used to say it, can I be more open to being? Is it okay for me to be open to what I'm actually experiencing and to treat it in a friendly way? And just like you were saying a moment ago, just have that attitude of curiosity, just kind of asking like a phenomenologist would, like, what is this really? And then waiting, not answering it. That's we normally jump in and answer our own questions. But instead, let the answer bubble up from the body. What is this really? You can ask it a few times, and then if there's no answer comes, let it go. Wait until lunchtime and say, is that still there? What is it really? And sooner or later, something will bubble up that you'll go, that's what it is. And you'll know that it's right because it's like that moment where you've remembered something. You know, that niggly feeling of having forgotten something. You know when you've remembered the thing you forgot because your whole body goes, yeah. It's looking for that kind of a bodily response and being open to the feeling until you get that. And not butting in and not trying to convince it of something else, just being patient and open to whatever's actually there.
Yeah. There's a wonderful overlap, Greg, with one of my discussions with Manu Bazzano, who's a Zen psychotherapist, and he talks about this rich tradition of koans. And one of the ancient koans is, what is this? It's so simple, but so profound, right?
Yeah.
What is this?
And sometimes you have to add the word really.
What is this really?
Only because it goes a little deeper. Like, okay, this time he wants the truth.
Uh-huh.
And something more comes sometimes. It's like the body has to know you're interested. I mean, the body is you. You can't trick it.
Mhm.
So you can't pretend to be interested and then get something. The body knows.
Mhm.
So it has to be real. It has to be a genuine relationship. You have to actually want to know yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there any components of your work that you'd like to pitch before we close?
No.
Yes.
I'm not selling anything. I have
He knows how to say no.
sell. I have nothing to sell.
But it's really refreshing. I really am refreshed by how you say no. You said it very clearly, I think 3 times through the discussion. There's this paradox with no. When a no is done well, it's just integrated with my body responses. There's a period at the end of the sentence. That there isn't a sense that you have to rescue me, or you feel like you need to rescue me, or that there's an encroachment of my space, or that you're apologetic for it, or something. The no curiously opens up, even though there's a period at the end of your sentence. The no actually opens something up for me.
I'm glad to hear that. The way I would understand that is it completes something so something more can come.
Yes.
The next thing can happen now.
And therein lies the paradox of a no done well is a yes.
I like that. That's really nice. I really like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that.
Well, it's been really fun, Greg. I appreciate the belly laughters quite a bit. You know, that's one of the things I really appreciate about you is like right from the beginning. Oh yeah, there's the belly. I can feel that belly right there in the laugh. And I really appreciate that.
Great. Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been fun.
Thank you for listening to The Boundless Body with the Somatic Doctor. Please leave a comment, subscribe, and like us on social media.
We're a swarm. We're a colony. We're a multiplicity.
Until next time, be well.